So what I want to suggest, our format will be, I'll ask one question of the panel, and then I'll ask the audience. So it's going to be a dialogue. It's not going to be us discussing and then you asking us questions, but a dialogue. And I want, one of the purposes in this panel is to reveal how much action is actually happening on the ground in local sustainability initiatives, and our focus today is particularly on cities. So if you know of innovations that we haven't mentioned as a result of our conversation, please do bring it forward when you ask your question. So we're going to focus on urban sustainable development. Why? Because as Mike Harcourt has talked about, the urban tsunami. 70% of the world's population will be living in large urban areas by 2050. Cities are often described as hubs of innovation and creativity, where access to amenities and services are great. In fact, my research team, one of our greatest debates was rural, small communities, mid-sized, and the large urban centers, and one of our team had grown up in a small rural community and found the lack of diversity and openness very, very hard, and so argued that cities were these places of where you flourish and the creativity and access. But they also coexist with very polluted, a lot of pollution, such as Beijing, where often spatial justice and inequalities coexist with wonderful architecture and art. But then again, we have some problems in cities. First Canadian Place, where I had the privilege of being on Wednesday night, apparently my nephew here in Toronto told me that the slabs, I think, of marble were falling off, and they had to close the area whenever there was a high wind. And Brent, maybe you know, I think they've just reclad the building at a cost of...
We don't know the cost, but BMO. Yeah.
I think it was pretty expensive. So there's a lot of existing building stock that's going to have to be reclad. So given this, and given their creativity and innovation, how can we ensure that we insert sustainability into some of the retrofitting of existing stock that has to occur in our cities? But then the other interesting thing I did on this trip to Toronto was, if you get in a cab here and you ask the driver, can I walk back from where you've taken me? The answer is almost uniformly no. So I decided to walk from where I was having lunch yesterday in Toronto. And I was thinking about, what are we going to discuss today? I don't know if you ever really know a city if you've never walked in it. I saw 3 squirrels playing by one of the buildings at U of T. I've never seen squirrels before in Toronto in my drives, my flying in, and whatever. So we're going to discuss things here, such as, for me, I think what large urban centers are about is walkability. If you never walk in a city, do you really know the place? Affordability, accessibility of all kinds, and foremost, sustainable urban development. So that's what we're going to try and talk about today, and I invite you to share your experiences, your knowledge, and your practice in what's happening in cities in Canada. I have the privilege of being flanked by an esteemed panel. Brent was in our first panel this morning. He's the Executive Director of Quest, the Quality Urban Energy Systems of Tomorrow. Mike Harcourt, unfortunately, can't be here today because he's sick, but when Mike had a catastrophic fall a couple of years back, he wrote a book called Plan B. It was about the importance of having a plan B when faced with a crisis or a tragedy of some kind. So Brent is our perfect Plan B. Quest is about leadership around the co-creation of smart energy communities in Canada. Previously, he was VP of Urban Solutions with the Canadian Urban Institute. He is a registered professional planner with specialized knowledge in the areas of integrated community energy, transportation and land use planning, downtown revitalization, and public infrastructure investment. He is also an instructor with Osgoode Hall Law School, with Osgoode Hall Law School and with the UBC Continuing Studies for Sustainability. On my right, I have the privilege of introducing Mary McDonald, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Conservation Officer at WWF Canada. Mary has led and built collaborative and innovative conservation initiatives across 5 continents, Southern Africa, Stockholm, where she contributed to drafting the UN Convention on Climate Change, Washington, D.C. At the City of Toronto, in her spare time, she built the rollout of more than 10 new initiatives, including the Climate Action and Clean Air Action Plan, to name only one. Mary has held positions at the Metcalfe Foundation, the Stockholm Environment Institute, the UN, and the World Bank, and the Earth Council. In addition to her work at the World Wildlife Fund Canada, Mary was an advisor to Mayor Michael Bloomberg of New York City in his capacity as chair of the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. When I make introductions like that, I think no one sleeps anymore. So, our first question centers around innovation. In 2009, Toronto was the first city in North America to require green roofs on new developments. Last year, Vancouver earned the World Green Buildings Council Award. Can each of you tell me what you consider to be the most successful local innovations in climate change adaptation and mitigation by a Canadian city? And I guess I'll turn to my left and then my right and reverse that with the next question.
Okay. One, I guess, is what we're being asked for.
If you've got another, you could add.
Got quite a few in my head. So,
2 max.
2 max, okay. All right then. Well, I'll choose ones I haven't mentioned this morning already for those who heard, and I think they're good examples for innovation. I'm going to choose ones around energy just for the point of ease of conversation. The first one, North American sewer heat capture, Olympic Village, Southeast False Creek. Why do I choose that one? Because it blended a couple of different issues together. One, we're excellent producers of energy. And we don't think about it that way. A human system is phenomenally efficient. And we have waste. And at the end of the day, that waste has about a lot of heat, about 60 degrees centigrade, depending where you are. And with that, it gets wasted. Why not use it? And they did. And they did it effectively so that at least it provides the base load of heat for that community. Meaning, I might have the numbers wrong, but there's at least a couple hundred units there, about 15,000 people, I think, in total, that get supplied, or their thermal energy needs, space heating, domestic hot water, can be addressed to a point through that sewer heat capture. And then, what I really liked about it is that we talked about trying to integrate existing systems, as Sephora mentioned, and so did Jane too earlier, that we wanted to look at the fact that hydrocarbons are still in use, there's still the use of different types of fuel sources, so how do you blend them together and how do you actually make them work? And that system has, of course, the importance of natural gas still being used to provide peaking. And so why I liked it was a balance. So it provided community good, addressed a local heat need, and it picked up on a free, affordable source of energy. Not a bad combination of just kind of pulling that together. There's still lots of costs associated there. Second one that I choose, I'll make another Canadian example then. It's a variation of this, is Alderney 5 project. I chose that one for you, and that's in Halifax. And what they chose to do there was combine different types of thinking again. They wanted to look at the fact that there was maybe a better way to effectively provide air conditioning, again. And so what they looked at was using the harbor for cooling. And so in this case, what they've done is allow for a number of boreholes that have been drilled in a particular area to create a cooling area that then allows, in this case, Atlantic cold water to flow in, and then can be the cooling out of that can be extracted to cool during peak periods of the summer for cooling purposes. Why is that interesting? Well, it was a partnership that was public and private. It also dealt with the way of thinking about energy systems that were local again, and how you could harness that. And it's a smaller scale from what they've done here in Toronto, but just as another example, so I gave you coast to coast examples of what communities are doing in terms of something that's innovative. And they're both, I chose them because other cities haven't done them. And so I thought that was pretty interesting.
Thanks, Brent. Mary, given your expertise, do you want to also include, if you know of a brilliant international example of innovation?
Alrighty. So I spent a lot of time at the city, a fair amount of time at the City of Toronto, a couple of years in the amazing Toronto Environment Office. I think sometimes people working in those jobs are unsung heroes. I don't think people realize how much it takes to get things done in the city. And then I was invited to become the environment lead in the mayor's office when David Miller was mayor. And so I can maybe say something about international because during the time he was mayor, he also became chair of the C40 Large Cities Climate Group, and maybe talk about that later. But anyway, it's funny because so my examples are going to be Toronto because they're easier for me. And also, Brent kind of took one, in a way, a similar one that gets us a lot of purchase internationally, which is our Deep Lake Water Cooling Program in downtown Toronto. 5 kilometers out in the lake, massive pipes bringing in cool water for air conditioning to 30 buildings, I think it is now, in the downtown core. And the great thing about that is it reduces emissions by 90%, but it has all these other unexpected benefits, which I think is one of the things when you make improvements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You often get a lot of things that you didn't expect were going to happen as well. So this is one of those things where it meant that a lot of the equipment that buildings had every few floors to push cool air in the summer throughout the buildings, the cool air coming from the Deep Lake Water Cooling is so efficient they were able to get rid of that and instead rent it out or use it as Class A office space. And I think that's an interesting angle on that. Over time, it's much cheaper than heating with electric cooling, and it's also more efficient. People sometimes said they're too cold. Anyway, I think it's an interesting and important project, and Toronto worked on that for over 20 years, and it's on a huge scale. And a lot of times when you're traveling in circles of cities internationally, you'll get asked about that project. I think the other one that has international clout, if you will, is the Better Buildings Partnership. Toronto, the former City of Toronto, the smaller, like 400, 500,000 City of Toronto, did a lot of innovative things back around the time of the Earth Summit in 1992. And one of the ones was starting to look at energy efficiency in buildings en masse and how they could get that started. And it took a while, but the model is basically where you get big commercial buildings, largely downtown, but also institutional buildings. Hospitals are involved in it now. And you try to, in the very early days, now it's so much more common, but in those early days it was hard to get banks to back a loan for energy efficiency that would then be paid back based on the savings on energy because you had a more energy efficient system in play. And I think that's been a huge success story, copied around the globe. I know London, they've done it in London. They've done it in Mexico City, and in both those cities, they came to Toronto for almost a year to learn what we'd done, and I think that's kind of interesting. The other thing about this one, currently Better Buildings Partnership, over 2,300 partnerships, has created over 30,000 person years of work. So transforming from conventional energy to alternatives can, as we know, create a lot of jobs. So far, it's saved over $350 million in energy efficiency for the buildings that are using this system, and saved over 600,000 metric tons of carbon. So it's a real success story. I'll say an international one that I think is kind of interesting. Again, it's a little older now, but it speaks to this idea, I think, in a way that cities. Often city politics is a nonpartisan place because cities and mayors are so close to the ground. They have to do a lot of practical things like water water management, waste management, all these kinds of things, transportation. And in the city of Paris, where it is a party system at the municipal level, there's so many parties that to form a government, they always have to form a kind of coalition. And one of the things that came out of that in kind of 2007, 2008 was the Valley bike share program in Paris. And who thought that, 15 years ago that Paris would be a place known for cycling. I mean, I don't know if you've ever taken that, ever done that and borrowed a bike in Paris. It's sort of, there's beautiful bike trails, and then suddenly you get let off into a massive roundabout with eight lanes of traffic, and then you get to the other side. Anyway, the thing about that is I think that was exceptional because it just was one person, a Green Party representative, and he was the only one represented for the Green Party in that election, convincing the rest of his colleagues that this would be a way for Paris to say, yes, we can be a low-carbon city, and it's very visible, and nobody will expect it of us. And I thought it's an interesting story.
So to address this kind of central Canada dominance in this panel, I'm going to bring up three things from BC based on our climate change research there in 11 climate change innovative communities. First of all of the 11 communities started with energy. They got energy efficiency right, and they also were able to use energy efficiency as a gateway into elected officials to ratchet up to higher level sustainability initiatives. The other thing is in the morning panel, it was referenced about the BC carbon tax. That was policy innovative because it was revenue neutral. Because it was revenue neutral, the incoming government could not take it away. And so that's the kind of policy innovations that we need to address wide electoral swings and to continue the innovation. And then someone correct me, and then I want to throw it open to the audience, please. There must be questions and other examples. I think, Dominica, Vancouver implemented a bylaw where every new building had to have a public art installation outside the building. And that's the other thing when I talked about walkability, accessibility. I've noticed when I've been in Vancouver and you pass a particularly beautiful art installation, people stop and they talk to one another. And you want that degree of connectivity for peace, law, and good order. So, up to you guys. Comments, questions? Examples. Please.
I think you have to use the mic because they're recording.
I'm really not a specialist in environment, but my question is always in the urban area. Do you have any project of introducing more wildness, more trees, more parks, more of that? I mean, and not only for climate change, but for what you say, connectivity and normal life for people, because I see buildings growing up and all full. I live in Quebec City. It's just every space is occupied by a new building instead of parks and everything. So this is one of my questions.
I know, Mary, we'll probably go back and forth on our similar knowledge here a little bit, because Toronto's been a leader. So, but I'll just talk about the urban forestry canopy and how critical that is anywhere in the world. The difference is immense in a city, and they've mapped that here in Toronto by a couple of degrees. That's huge. When you go from one location of one city to another, and it's changing by degrees in terms of temperature as a result of the amount of hard infrastructure that's there. And so who's done what and what's getting innovative then around the world for planting and for the importance of heritage? Well, I can actually tell you that a lot of communities across Canada, whether Ontario or even the United States, have, as part of the movement in planning, if you'd like, healthy communities now really focuses on their urban forestry. And so how do you make sure that you are protecting enough right-of-way for tree planting? Because when we start to build our communities smaller, the right-of-way and the amount of space available for tree planting disappears. And so now we have to kind of come back to what we used to do. And just to put this in a social perspective, there's been a study and that was done to look at how people interact and what people choose as the more comfortable space. And they had three pictures. They had a picture of a community that was a new urbanism, as they often use the term in planning, but it was what I would say new subdivision. So no trees, not too much there, but you had a little bit of green space at the front. And then they looked at a semi-1990 kind of development that was a little bit more growth, a little bit more mature, and then they looked at a historical community that had been there for hundreds of years with big growth trees. And guess what everybody chose where they wanted to live? The old growth area. Why? Because it was comforting, it was cooling, and it was inviting. And where was it? The three communities were all in the same space. They're all in London, Ontario. And I just thought I'd give you as an example about when we're talking about innovation, sustainability, walkability, and affordability. Affordability was a big difference, though, about where one could afford in those three communities and where you could live. They talked also about the idea of walkability, where the older community was still more walkable but less affordable because of the price of where it was. And so you had all these trade-offs going on. It was a great little study, but I guess I just wanted to raise that as an example of how we can blend some of our discussion a little bit. You have to kind of come back to the fundamentals of sustainability and creating placemaking, to use a term. Sorry, this is getting plannerese a little bit in discussion, and there's a number of planners in the room. But placemaking is, in simplicity for everyone, is where we want to be and why we want to be there. And we've kind of come full circle about urban design. I think that's what we were talking a little bit today as well. Some days you have to go back to what worked and why people hang out in a certain space, because it was comfortable, it was cool, it was inviting, and that's where you wanted to be. And we've kind of built out of that. And now we're coming full circle. Big part of that is urban forestry canopy. And I'll let Mary talk to Toronto, because there's then some neat stuff, or anywhere you like.
Well, Toronto has a target to double their tree canopy. Obviously, it took a hit last year after the ice storm, lost a huge amount of trees as a result of that. But I wanted to just talk about a couple of things. So, first of all, yes, the other thing the City of Toronto has is this green roof program. And it reminded, there's an incentive if you want to put a green roof on your home. It started about 6 or 7 years ago. Only commercial and industrial roofs were eligible for the incentive. I think it's, I can't remember exactly the amount of money, but it's significant. But now residents can as well. And partly that was put in place to control, the main reason that was put in place wasn't so much carbon sequestering, but for runoff during severe storms, and just to help with the water management in the city. The thing I want to talk a little bit about, though, is biodiversity in cities, because now that I've been at WWF since January this year, and there is a growing interest in maximizing not the biodiversity that exists in cities and reducing the impact that cities have on the region, the biodiversity region around them, and how they draw on that, how they draw from that, and the impacts that has on natural systems and critical habitat, things like that. And sort of two examples come to mind. One thing is there's a group called Green Roofs for Healthy Cities. I know when I was at the Metcalf Foundation, we gave some support, as did some others, to this work they're doing of going to a few small cities across Ontario, and working with leaders there in the community and in the business world, who else, community groups, elected officials, and to design their main street as if it was a beautiful biodiverse area. And it's kind of interesting. And the final outcome is going to be like a visual with a set of steps to get that community to have that look. Because as Brent said, so many people are comfortable and drawn to that, and it feels healthy and it feels right. But at WWF, under our soon-to-be launched Nature Connected Communities, we're working with the City of Montreal in particular right now on a new initiative called, I want to get the name right, Montreal Center for Excellence in Urban Biodiversity. And Montreal is very committed to the idea of strengthening their biodiversity, increasing it in every way they can. And it's a very interesting initiative, and I stay tuned. It's still under development, but it has financial institutions, it has support from all the regional governments around and in Montreal. And I think they're also looking to provide examples of how to do this better, how to live in a city, but make it a place that's green and healthy as well, from that green urban infrastructure perspective.
Jamie.
Thanks, Anne. I'm Jamie Laidlaw, unaffiliated. This is for Brent, but also Mary touched on it. When you mentioned the communities, the three communities and the comparables, what you didn't touch upon was the access of time. Not just about old trees, it's about old people and stories in a neighborhood. And I think we're going to recover a sense of who we are and the place and our trajectory. We're going to have to know a lot more about the stories. And indeed, Anne, when you mentioned public art, sometimes it's not accessible to people. There's no story that goes with it. There's no history. There's an example of one of those pieces right on St. George Street, right in the heart of the U of T, which is a pretty fine piece donated in '73 that's been used to paper posters on, has had a blockade put in front so people don't run their bikes into it, and generally ignored by the students, completely ignored that David Silcox is trying to raise money to have restored and moved at some point in time. So there's some appreciation, but there's also some other issues that arise around our fidelity to our historical story and our narrative and our roots. And Brent, Mary, I wonder if you could identify some of those for us.
Yeah. Actually, just on your point on, this is bringing my days back at the Canadian Urban Institute and the studies that we used to do on the broader issue of aging. And I just wanted to put this out there for people too, because it does relate to stories, it does relate to our communities and everything we're talking about. So in 1960s, 1 in 10 people were over the age of 65. In 10 to 15 years, 1 in 4 people will be over the age of 65. That's rapid change in how you think about your society in terms of services, needs, and affordability. And I think when we get into, if I understood the full question correctly, just in terms of how we bring culture and also bring in the issues, even accessibility, if you'd like, just in terms of all of that and how that fits into how we do storytelling in cities. Partly we've missed that in some of our urban design, but I think we're actually starting to see, coming back to that now, where people are trying to, whether it's heritage preservation and where people are comfortable with what we're seeing. The Sterling District is a little bit of example in Toronto, but when I've really started to see, and I think I'll just focus on this aspect of aging just for people's interest here, because I think it ties in all 4 of our themes. We don't talk about it. And I just wanted to raise that as a whole. So we have to realize as a society, and we're not a big population, we're going to be we're going to have a very large senior population and a very small younger population. And it will change how we think about and where we live. And you heard this morning stranded assets. There were some studies done, and just to put this in context for you, so in Japan and in Italy, OECD countries with the fastest rapidly growing aging populations in the world. So there, 1 out of every 10 homes is now abandoned. There's no one living in them. They've been built, but there's no one to replace them. So they have this growing glut of infrastructure and housing that's being left. You have to, and I'm getting to your point here a little bit. So we're also seeing where our original divisions and where people lived, where they actually were, like Don Mills here in Toronto. People live and grow in the same place, but there isn't always a lot of people moving back into them. Don Mills is not the best example, but they're starting to see that right across Canada now. What happens, and this is very important for the banking community and insurance world now, they're worried about their assets not being paid off, and that there's no one who's going to move back into them now. And we haven't had these conversations yet about affordability, how people get around, but also with the senior in terms of isolation. And I think this is kind of your point too. It's a huge issue. Once you get to a point of age, above the age of 65, and I'm sorry to pick on that age group and above,
Yeah,
but
please.
I'm sorry, Anne, not to do it. The likelihood of you losing your license grows rapidly, and your ability to have connectivity and be able to socialize diminishes rapidly, and the impact on you as an individual is phenomenal. And I had a chance to look at a lot of that, and it's something we do not talk about, and unfortunately it is happening now. And you're having people who are isolated, who aren't being connected to their community, who can't get assistance, and it's your next door neighbor. And this is something that we're forgetting about, and it's part of our conversation, I think, a little bit today. So I hope I addressed your question a little bit. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Connectivity is really important. Connectivity not just to our own species, but to other species, I think.
Connectivity to other species, gosh.
Well, if you never experience them, if you never have any
It's
experience with them.
true. No, it is true, and I think that's why WWF, we're looking at launching this nature-connected communities. I think that the early days, the idea was to make people aware of things. Like Earth Hour is a good example of making people aware. Turn off your light. And for just a little short time, carbon emissions go down, and people feel like they did something, but then they kind of go about their normal life. And everybody knows there's kind of a hunger, I think, in many people to engage in the natural world, to go for a walk in a beautiful natural place. In a lot of places, people fish, dare I say, hunt. You know, all these places where that are far from the city usually. And how do we bring that? Toronto is lucky because we have a big ravine system. But so World Wildlife Fund is looking at a number of programs on several fronts of how we get people engaged in actually improving towards conservation outcomes. For instance, engaging communities around freshwater, watershed management, around specific tasks. So we'll ask you we're going to make some really fun, simple things to do that when we do it all together, will have an impact. And I think instead of kind of raising awareness, I think everybody knows we have a lot of challenges with sustainability now. One of the things I wanted to just touch on, which might sound a little bit kooky, but when you talk about, you bring culture into sustainability in the more traditional use of sustainability, which kind of tends to ignore culture and environment. Sometimes it's a synonym just for environment, but that's not really what it's supposed to be. Some of the things, I saw a competition when I was in Copenhagen a while ago of integrating solar panels into public art. And I wish I had some pictures because it's so creative and it's such an interesting angle on it. One of the things, there was a sort of a subcategory of integrating solar panels into playground equipment. And so some of the playgrounds that were designed, and also one in particular is in place now, not only incorporates, you know, like sunflowers with great big solar panels in them, but that thing that everybody probably thinks about when you go to a park with a little kid, capturing the energy of kids on the you know, running up and down and on the equipment, and it goes back into the grid as well. So there's ways of, and kids they talk to kids about that too.
I was going to say, just on that, if you want to go take a look at that, in London, Ontario, TD Bank built the first carbon neutral bank with that park. So it is a solar park, and it's big looking flowers with PVs and everything. So they actually, all their land, and then they had a public park, and they interface the two together. So it's actually a great example. They probably got it from Denmark.
Okay, we shouldn't keep our guests standing in line so long.
We've got a
Next
big lineup
question,
here.
please. Yes.
I'm Chris Kennedy. I'm a professor of civil engineering, University of Toronto. Nice to meet you again, Mary. We've met a few times. I'm also a senior fellow at the Global Cities Institute, which is actually upstairs in this building. I want to give a blunt question about carbon mitigation in Canadian cities. I can start Toronto-centric, but we can broaden it. So if you look at the carbon footprint of Toronto now, it's dominated by natural gas and transportation fuels. We've made great progress in other areas. And you could look across the country. I mean, if you go to BC or Manitoba or Quebec or now Ontario, any of these provinces that have really low carbon electricity now, we're down to those two major issues, the natural gas to heat our homes and the transportation fuels. So if we were trying to go to the next level and reduce our carbon emissions a lot more, how would you do it? What do you see from looking at the planning socioeconomic context? Where do you see the opportunities to make major cuts in one or both of those two areas in the next 10 years, say?
10 years, okay. Mary, did you want to start first? Do you want to?
Can I throw something in?
I'm not a
Yeah, of
planner.
course.
Can I throw something in? In an e-dialogue we led at Royal Roads in, it doesn't matter the years, early 2000s, Danny Harvey, who's both an economist and a climatologist, said simply retrofitting existing building stock, no new technologies would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30%. You add in new technology, 60%. And all of the incentives that we have for green buildings, more sustainable buildings, are all new buildings. It gets back to Jamie's comment, about what is it we value? Where are the narratives? Where are the stories that are really important to us? So, Oh, is he geography?
Yeah, he's
Excuse me,
geography department.
okay.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I know, and Danny was one of my professors. But inspiration here. So, Eleanor, you're in the audience, and Eleanor's got the job of doing that question. How do we reduce? How do we actually reduce this? And building cladding, energy efficiency improvements in existing stock. New is great. New is slow in the sense of the total amount of growth we're going to get. It's still a lot, but the simple reality is we've built our environment. So what we're talking about is how do we fix that existing environment? And that takes a lot more effort and a lot more somewhat ingenuity, but it's not that new. And the tower renewal program that has been thoroughly thought through for the last 4 years, and we're all looking forward to seeing it get launched extensively across the city, has that capacity to do what we all want to do, which is reduce our energy consumption, thereby reducing greenhouse gas emissions, at the same time providing a whole bunch of other interesting benefits. That's one big step. Second big step, and there's all kinds of good work. For those who want to take a look, and I'll keep the answer short then, there's some great work that's been done on this kind of modeling. And you can look at it actually where I used to formerly work, the Canadian Urban Institute, had 6 municipalities in Ontario do this backcasting. You heard about that last night for those who are in the audience. To understand, they had a goal, how do you get there? What can you do? The most cost-effective thing, energy efficiency improvements. The least cost-effective thing at that time was usually very expensive types of products. At one time that was photovoltaics, right? Just because of their pure cost. That's gone down a lot, and it will continue to do so. Things that were really, really simple, and the challenge, though, is always going to be on transportation. So in that 10-year period we're talking about, and I'll come to address your point about natural gas, but just on transportation, that is the Achilles heel, and trying to address it. Why? Because you have to change either the mode of what you transport in or the fuel of what you're trying to address. Either one of those are quite tough because you have to change the entire societal kind of structure of that. But fuels are happening. Fuels are really happening. We're seeing more growth in electric vehicles. That infrastructure is still missing to a point. In terms of alternative ways of meeting the 2 biggest components of energy use in buildings, that's space heating and domestic hot water. If I can leave you with anything else, when you think about energy, it's not how much energy you use in your car, that's important, but just think about the fact that this room has to be conditioned. We have to feel warm. Think of the amount of energy it takes to warm this space up. Now take every building in Canada and think of the same amount of energy that has to be done. Then when you step into your shower in the morning, remember how much energy that you're actually using when you turn it on to make it hot, because it's cold. It's very cold when it comes into your home. So if you want to start there, that's where the challenge is. Right now, the reality is we've built on natural gas because it was affordable and it meets that level of energy intensity that you need to get to that energy level of heat. That's just physics. But there's other ways of getting that down. You've got to make your buildings more efficient first. And I want to get this across. You can't plug and play. You can't put photovoltaics on. You can't plug other stuff in the building and assume that that building is going to become all of a sudden net by those other sources. It wasn't built for that. It was built for carbon. So until we actually reduce the carbon load of our buildings, which we don't talk about in that sense, it's really tough to address what we're going to do. You got to make them more efficient first. Then you can start using all kinds of other technologies that are actually able to meet that. So heating is tough, because then you got to look at geo-exchange opportunities, or you got to change the fuel coming into that home. Because there's only 2 ways of getting that home right now, a wire or a pipe. I'll stop there. I'm just getting excited because it's an issue, right? It's how do you get there? It's tough.
I just wanted to ask Chris what he might suggest, because really he is an expert in this stuff. And is there 1 or 2 things that you think we should be thinking about for space heating in cities? Let's take that, or transportation, because you're also very, very immersed in those issues. But but it's top of mind for you.
Yeah,
I know.
Chris, you better use the mic because I think they're recording.
And I'm sorry to keep you standing on it.
I was able to get more of the on the ground than the academic view, but I was at an IEA meeting in Paris just a couple of weeks ago, and there was a slide shown of a highway in Norway where they have an HOV lane. Well, really it's a lane that if you have an electric car, you get to use this lane, and we meant to go faster than the other 2 lanes, which are for regular cars. Only this slide showed that the lane for the electric cars was congested and full, right? And the other 2 lanes were just going freely.
Where were you?
I was in Paris, and it was a picture from Norway, because evidently, it's not official yet, but Norwegian electric vehicle market reached 15% this year, which is huge, right? That's a big number. So as long as you're below about 600 tons of carbon per gigawatt hour, and so you've got a relative medium to low carbon electricity, electric vehicles are a good solution. They're still expensive, but I think the transportation problem could be solved by electric vehicles. And if not, there are alternative fuel vehicles of other ilk. So, but to get around to the natural gas, I completely agree. Brent, you gave a good answer in terms of you've got to improve the efficiency of your envelope, whether it's old buildings or new buildings. But I also think that the thermal energy storage, that using, it's really, in a sense, it's really simple. It may be expensive, but we have all the heat we want during the summer, and we just need to store the heat underground and bring it out in the winter. And in the winter, we get all the cool we need. We need to vice versa, turn it around and bring it out in the summer, like the Okotoks scheme has done. So those kind of technologies, if we can continue to make improvements in them, lower the costs, do what we've done with PV over the last 20 years plus, then maybe there's some hope in those technologies.
Thanks.
Dr. Birch.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I'm Sarah Birch. I'm at the University of Waterloo. I teach in their new Masters in Climate Change program. And at the risk of moving us slightly away from this very enticing topic of mitigation and energy issues, I'd like to perhaps inject a little conversation about adaptation as well, if we're talking about both dimensions of climate change responses. And I'll give an example of something exciting that I think is going on, and then I have a question for you, Mary. So I think that a conversation that's lacking is one about ecosystem-based approaches to adaptation and mitigation. And I think part of the reason for that is that ecosystem-based approaches, EBA, they're often spoken of in the biodiversity community and the Convention on Biological Diversity, not in the climate change community, ironically enough. So one example that I know quite well is called the Wallasey Island Wild Coast Project, not here in Toronto. It's in the UK. I am, in fact, an import from the West Coast to Toronto here, so I'm learning a lot. But anyway, Wallasey Island is a project wherein the very powerful Royal Society for the Protection of Birds orchestrated a transfer of material that was dug up to build the Crossrail project in London, and moved all of that dirt and waste material to a little spot on the west coast, east coast, of England that was being degraded by rising sea levels and storms and such, and built this incredible series of wetlands and enhanced habitat. So the purpose there was to build habitat for birds, but nonetheless it also created a benefit for the Crossrail project that was trying to get rid of this waste material anyway, offered opportunities for recreation, for education, for oyster farming, for all kinds of things. It also sinks more carbon than it did as sort of a subpar agricultural land. So it did all of these things at the same time by using ecosystems to do things we want them to do, like purify our water, sink carbon, create a home for all kinds of critters, etc. So there are examples like this all around the world where we get multiple priorities recognized simultaneously. And for you, Mary, I would just ask, you mentioned that when we do GHG reduction, we often get benefits that are pleasantly unexpected. But I wonder, isn't the task to expect those, to find them, sell them, make them part of the pitch for transformative greenhouse gas reduction and adaptation, and speak the language of the various decision makers and civil society groups that are making decisions about these issues?
Completely agree. World Wildlife Fund is in Canada, which is probably sick of me saying that, but anyway, we're about to launch a 5-year plan, and the real crux of it, the shift, I think, is that we're working where nature and economy intersect, because we think that's why we have a lot of the issues that we do, particularly in the environment. It's sort of an obvious one, but we're looking to demonstrate that there's win-wins, that you can get those win-wins, because the economy cycles over here, environmental conservation concerns tend to cycle over here. It's changing somewhat, but really, let's face it, it continues to be And because we're World Wildlife Fund, there still will be a few places where we'll say, not here. Like, why would you build a refinery where belugas calve, where they have their young? I mean, why would you put it there? There's other places you could put it, why would you put it there? Anyway, to your point, one of the things, and I think because now there's for last year there's been a new CEO at WWF, it's David Miller, who was a former mayor of a city, former chair of the C40. The idea about how we talk about these things in a fresh and comprehensive way so that people who are kind of on side with us already but don't make decisions based on these kinds of issues that we really care about, that they hear what we're saying in communities where we want to see change. For instance, we know that as soon as you start saying, we've got to, well, I mean, in a certain context, we've got to improve our energy efficiency to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's hard to know what percentage. We've done some polling at WWF, but a very large percentage of people just go, oh, I don't know. I don't care about that. I mean, I care, but I don't know what they're talking about. I'm not listening anymore. And we get the 25 to 30% of people like, we're with you. Yes, we agree. But it's always those same sort of people. And yet there's a feeling, I don't know where people are from here, but certainly across Canada, I think people are natural environmentalists. Canadians care a great deal about the natural world. And I think one of our challenges is to talk to them about the impacts that certain types of development are having on natural systems, and say it in a way that you can relate to. I know one of our kind of catchphrases at the moment is we're going to work towards abundant species in a prosperous economy, which still isn't perfect, but it's a kind of we're trying, and basically we're actually going to get some outside help to help us with flashier messaging. But it's interesting, I agree that to talk about it in a more comprehensive way so people think that's actually relates to the work I do, whether it's in my work or the work that I do or how I live day to day at home. And I think you're right. I think we have to start talking about these things in a way, because if you say biodiversity, it's very interesting in developing this plan at WWF, the difference between, say, the comms and fundraising section of the organization that wants us to talk about basically animals, species, and the science group that says, well, you must use, and nature, they want us to talk about nature, whereas the science group keeps saying, well, that's meaningless. We really need to talk about biodiversity and high conservation value, and let's do an ecosystem value overlay on our renewable energy mapping, and all of a sudden, you've sort of lost, even within our own organization, half the people that work there. So I think it's an excellent point.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, I'm Megan Meany with ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability. I was wondering, you started this morning talking about what drives innovation at the local level, and I wondered about your opinions on big, bold, like elected official political target setting. So a lot of people don't talk about this fact that the City of Toronto was the first government in the world to set an emissions reduction target back in 1989. Not just the first local government, but the first government, right? And it sounded a lot like the Kyoto Protocol targets, like a percentage below a baseline level by a target year. And then, like, fast forward a decade or two, and City of Vancouver sets a target to become like the greenest city. And staff scrambled to figure out what that meant, right? And how they would measure that, and how would they'd report on it and document it. And now I find we're hearing more cities talk about being net energy zero. I don't really know what that means, and I'm sure there's a lot of staff in, like, the City of Markham that's figuring out what that means. So these big, bold political targets, do they drive innovation, or do they just drive the staff crazy?
Thanks, Megan. Good question. I personally think they do drive innovation, because when people say these targets, and I think this comes actually to the issue of, for instance, even international agreements like UN treaties. In a lot of ways, they're way up here. And I know from having worked in different places that even depending on your personality type and your skill set, you'll be more interested in trying to get some sort of progress on issues like climate change at different places in the system. So the international work is always, there's a lot of meeting and greeting and strategizing and VIPs and VVIPs and everything. And those people, in a way, I think, if they didn't do that job of setting targets, what would we all aim for? I know, particularly when they set ambitious ones, I know the EU set a target of 30% reduction by 2020 at one point, about 10 years ago, and it really made people start thinking, well, that's probably impossible. But actually, eventually, Toronto took on that target, as did a lot of cities around the world. And the thing about targets, it's interesting, because at Toronto, again, I'm sorry I keep on bringing up Toronto, but the ones I know off the top of my head, yes, we did set that target of 6% reduction based on 1990 levels by the year 2012. We actually hit 15% reduction, which is really good. And some of that's because the province took away the coal-fired power plants. That was kind of an easy win. But if you look at City of Toronto operations, it's almost down 40% from 1990 levels as of 2012. So just the operations, but that's a lot of energy, like for the big waste management treatment centers, the methane capture that now gets captured in certain landfills, spent landfills, and made into electricity into the grid and things like that. So I mean, I do think the targets are really, really important, even though a lot of people say, well, what are all the steps to get there? Now we see, I don't want to go too far off on this, but the Global Climate Fund, these big, okay, we're all going to put like $100 billion into addressing climate issues. And then everybody's, who's giving how much and what are we doing with it? Nobody knows yet, really, obviously, right? But I think when you set the targets, it does inspire people.
I know we're short on time, so I'll be quick. I have the real pleasure of working with a visionary person, Michael Harcourt. And when you work with that kind of leadership, vision is important. And I've learned that through my own work, but I'm actually going to let Anne maybe answer this question instead of me, from her perspective of watching someone like Mr. Harcourt, being a mayor and a premier, and the kind of leadership that he gave and the importance of vision. I don't know, Anne, can you?
I think it's terribly important. And if you dare to dream, you've got to create the dream. And I would characterize the Canadian landscape currently at the federal level as no dreams, no grand visions. So where does that get us? So if you look at some of the biggest successes in our country, they were grand visions. I'll move over to BC just for a moment, my dear colleagues. Granville Island and the renewal of the Toronto Harbourfront. They were grand visions, but there was an important difference then. There was alignment between political leaders and their civil servants, and unprecedented cooperation in the example of Granville Island between federal, provincial, and municipal officials and politicians. And that's what drove it. So I think they're critical, and I think they should be as ambitious and as bold. But we live in an environment where you can't fail anymore. It's the 2-second television bite. So we gotta move it away from that, and we can do that using the electoral process.
Hello, my name is Dominika Babicki, and fortunately my question is probably a little bit more on the negatives of what's happening in Canada. I'm doing a joint PhD between France and Canada, comparing buildings in Europe and in Canada, especially with regards to climate change and energy. And I guess having lived and worked in Canada, I was an energy manager at the District of North Vancouver, and I'm now doing this research in France and living in France. I just wonder sometimes, I mean, there are these wonderful one-off projects, I don't want to say one-off, but these projects in Canada. But I guess what I've come to realize living in Europe, that they are just simply more sustainable than we are on their everyday kind of living. We talk about targets. Well, Europe is doing the 20% reduction in energy and CO2 by 2020, and they're meeting it. And they're doing it. They're doing a whole-scale energy transition. They're not talking about mitigation and adaptation. They see the whole kind of situation in a very different way we are. And I guess my question is, I know London, Ontario has come up a couple of times, and I've come to live in London, Ontario for the first time in my life. And while there are these great communities, I went to see Wharton because it was on the CIP, best places to live, and it's very cute and quaint, but it's, about 4 blocks. The rest of London, Ontario is one big strip mall, and everything around London, Ontario are strip mall communities. And how can we seriously move towards sustainability because we are the greatest energy, water, and waste producers per capita in the world? And is this really feasible? And what are the solutions? So maybe there is none truly, but I just want to put it out there.
I'll take a shot and then I'll let others maybe jump in, and maybe other people in the audience would like to actually provide a response. I think that would be really interesting. I'm Channel Michael Harcourt. He'd say every community needs a sustainability plan. Why? Because it gets you thinking about what it takes to get there, and it starts forcing the tough questions to come out and the tough conversations at the end of the day. But at the same time, we have 2 things that work against us. We have plentiful amounts of land that is extremely cheap at the end of the day, and at the end of the day, we have really inexpensive energy. And if you want to boil it down, unfortunately, those 2 things work against you when you are in a constrained environment, when you don't have access to less expensive energy, and you don't have your own energy in a lot of those parts of Europe, where we do. And when you have an abundant amount of land, second or third largest country in the world by land mass, it makes it a little tougher to make some of those arguments. But with that in mind, having good policy in place, I think, makes a huge difference. BC, Greater Vancouver area, took a lot of time and a lot of heartache to get some good regional planning in place to start to think about the importance of land use and how to effectively protect sensitive lands, farming and so forth. Same theory in Ontario. We hadn't had a conversation in almost 40 years for the provincial government's responsibility on larger scale regional planning. We did. They put in a lot of policies in place. We won't see the outcome of a lot of these policies for another 10 to 20 years, just in the physical sense of where we're going and what we're having. But to even put this in more stark contrast, it had been 50 years since the city of Calgary had updated its official plan for that city. It's a little long, don't you think? Right? But there was no provincial requirement for them to do so. So it was open season. Right? Anyway, those are my points.
Say one quick thing, which is, there is, when you live different places, there's a cultural element in all of this too. It's
Very
not,
much so.
And that's something I think we need to think more about. And you look in certain parts, even in our own country. Vancouver's a good example, where there seems to be a very strong culture of a grouping of like-minded people that believe in doing things a certain way, and it includes a lot of this sustainable living stuff that we're interested in. And so you go to other countries like Denmark or Norway or Sweden. I lived in Sweden for almost a decade. The vast majority of people in Sweden, for better or worse, all speak the same language. They have the same religion in their background. They haven't had a long history of a lot of immigration, and I'm not saying that that's causing, but they're very like-minded from the word go for many generations. And I sometimes think if somebody has an idea, quite quickly a lot of people will think, that makes sense to me from a cultural perspective. So I think that's one of the challenges in North America, the New World, where everybody comes with lots of different ideas and different backgrounds. It's also a good thing.
Thank you. I'm David Leighton Brown from York University. We began the panel with some impressive landmark initiatives like the Toronto Pipe, the Olympic Village sewage treatment, that were energy efficient, reducing carbon emissions, cheaper in the long run, and sustainable. Win-win. But those examples involved a very large upfront capital investment. And I'm concerned about what you would think about how to get from here to there. Is the private sector the likely source of that upfront capital investment, or are payback times so long that before return on investment produces those cheaper returns, it's simply not within the feasibility of a corporation? Is the private sector the source of that capital, the public sector the source, or in the fiscally constrained times of today where there are not enough resources for everything that needs to be done, this is an additional cost that is simply not there. Are private-public partnerships the source? And if so, what are the best examples? How can we get the capital to do these good things?
I'd like to ask Eleanor to answer that question. No, I'm just kidding. You know, one of the things thanks for the question. One of the things for cities, I'm often at events, and this isn't one of them, where people are talking a lot about cities and there's not a single person who's ever worked in a city in the room. They have a lot of ideas for cities. One of the challenges with cities with capital from the private sector, the way things are set up now, it's just really, really hard to do business with the private sector when you are a public, like when you're a government. You're constantly, and I think this probably gets to the heart of public-private partnerships in some ways, but even sponsorships. Like if you say, you know, with the Tower Renewal Program, that's a program to retrofit a huge number of 1950s and 60s residential buildings across the city of Toronto. You could maybe get one private sector investor who was interested in supporting some sort of massive redo of one of these buildings. But the problem is, legally, it's very hard to do that. It gives them, does it give them a leg up compared to other businesses? Does it give them too much profile? Are they getting something out of it that actually the city should just be getting out of it? So these kinds of things are hard to do. And one of the things I'm seeing emerging, during the Climate Summit Week in New York in September, quite a few city organizations and a number of financial institutions and multilateral development banks and even World Wildlife Fund signed on to something called, I want to get this, Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. And what this is about is, there's a whole bunch of things it's about, but one is making the case that for all, in the discussion of all these global climate funds that are starting to come forward, cities get access to some of those funds because right now they're all targeted at national governments. But the other thing it is focused on, and many of them are targeted on developing country governments, so there's that problem too. But the other problem is that cities, wait a minute, hold on, climate action. Oh, the other thing, yeah, cities have a hard time sometimes not being naive about doing business with the private sector. And so one of the things that the Cities Climate Finance Alliance is focused on is getting cities credit worthy and credit savvy and learning how to work with business better. So the idea is setting up maybe more neutral funds that aren't just one-on-one relationship type investments, but pulling together larger funds that cities can access, but in a way that they understand what they're getting into.
So my response would be, yes, there's room for private sector investment. Yes, there's room for public sector investment. And yes, there is room for public-private partnerships. Each one is going to be slightly different depending on where you are in the country and what is taking place. But yes, there's a lot more private sector capital or equity now. It's using the term fluid. It's very available. Now what they're looking for is where to plunk it and how best to do that. And so we've seen private developers building energy systems because there's an equity return opportunity, which it used to be is the municipality had to take on all of that risk. And it's a big risk, but it's become because it's a market opportunity now. And so I think we're going to start to see a little bit of recalibration. That was more on the West Coast I was just referring to. A little bit slower here in Ontario, but I think the public-private partnerships have really taken off here, and there is a role for them. You see big companies like GE Canada or Siemens who kind of go around knocking on municipal doors saying, we have money.
It's hard to do business with them.
Well, yeah, don't get me wrong. And a lot of people also are not financially literate. And yeah, I think there's...
I have a bigger problem being from the inside seeing it. These large corporations come to take total advantage of these municipalities and, you know, put in systems that then cost these municipalities huge amounts of money. It's a huge danger, and I think we need to be very, very cautious how we go through to implement PPPs.
Yeah, PPPs.
I think we all would agree there's no one single right answer, and it does have to be grounded in place. I'm very honored to take the question from this esteemed gentleman next.
My name is Jerry Regan from Halifax. My question is not unrelated to the previous question and to Mary McDonald's comments on it. But it is inevitable that urbanization is going to continue. And as your document indicates, another 40 years, 70% of the public will be living in mega cities. And is it inevitable that there must be an alteration in the division of jurisdiction between the federal, provincial, and municipal governments to deal with the problems that must be solved if sustainability within mega cities are to be dealt with? The problems that the cities will be facing and already are facing are so different from those that were considered when legislation was originally established and divided between those levels. So I would like your views on that subject and whether you think it's achievable, or will the politicians be too reluctant to give up their own authority?
This is the big elephant in the room. Brent, do you want to start first?
Sure. At some point in time, I'll hypothesize that yes, we might actually have to have that kind of constitutional conversation, potentially. I think that this is not me talking as Quest, but just as an individual. When you get to a certain point in your growth in society, there's a difference, right? There's a lot of federal state governments already. The reality is you have one major city and a federal government of some sort. It's a lot of parts of Europe and other parts. But for the moment, I'll use the Canadian context. What's happened is there's been a shift. There's been a shift back from the federal government to look at reinvesting in communities and in cities. But it has to work through the constraints of what we've got here. But that dialogue has started. For the last few Federation Canadian municipality events that I've attended, there's been a dominant federal government presence where only 5 years ago there wasn't. And so that is a big signal to a lot of people that they're taking a tremendous role on the infrastructure file. But it's beyond infrastructure. That's the issue. And I think that's where we'll have to get into a deeper conversation going forward. This is where, in some ways, the United States has the benefit of where they can have the executive decision to engage at the municipal level. And that makes a big difference. And why they are potentially rapidly urbanizing even faster than we will, not just by population, but by the level of support and effort that can be directed in policy. And it's working. And you're seeing that happen slowly. So that's my personal view on that, but I'll turn it over to others on the panel.
When you work in a city and you have no real powers of taxation, just residential taxes, you're very limited. And so when you go to make an investment in things like renewable energy for massive infrastructure, you really start thinking about things that maybe seem sort of more sort of a self-centered view of things as a city. But I remember when we were setting up this renewable energy fund just for retrofitting buildings that belong to the city, and it was early days. It was a bit of a fight. People weren't sure you were going to get money back from energy efficiency that hadn't totally been proven yet. But one of the things that kept popping up was, yeah, but if we do all this work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the province is really going to benefit because health will improve and their costs will go down, and they're not willing to help us with that. So I think that's another sort of example that speaks to some of the issues is in 2008, the federal government did put out a big fund for sort of stimulating economic growth across the two cities, and you had to apply for this money. And I remember the City of Toronto Council decided we're going to apply for it for our TTC, and they said, no, you can't use it for TTC. It has to be projects, I forget the number, but like 10,000 and under. So we had to apply for like 300 sidewalk renovations, which we're probably all experiencing still when you walk around the city. But so I think it really is something, agreed, it is something that needs to be sorted out. And I said it before about with climate change, right now all the funds, the talk about funds is on national governments. But who's the most nimble? Who can get the most effective things done? Who has statutory responsibilities for transportation and high energy use, water processing, and all these kinds of things? It's big cities and big cities around the world. So I think it's true in Canada, and I think it's true in most countries around the world. And if we're going to see a big change, I know the C40 has called it the 10 to 15% gap. Like, cities don't really, the contribution they make to reducing greenhouse gas emissions often don't get counted because they look at national sectors and the changes in national sectors. And it's hard to, the cities drill down more. They get into things like individuals making decisions in their day-to-day life. So I think it's an excellent point and probably something we should really talk more about.
I think we have to open up a national dialogue on that one because, I mean, talk about a built-in incentive to keep developing at the local level because of the tax structure. That's the only way you can supposedly grow is by developing. I'm going to ask that the next two questioners, we'll combine your questions to the panel in the interest of time because I've been instructed that we must break it.
Okay, Alan Schiff, Toronto. Half of my days are spent with the climate change issue, various NGOs and involvement in activity. The other half, I guess I represent the elephant in the room. Namely, we operate a management and construction company. We have 1960s 20-story apartment buildings, and what do we do about it? Well, number one, we'll only do what the tenants can afford, not what we can afford, what the tenants can afford. These are rental buildings. So we'll abide by the economics. And why wait, as it says up there? We'll wait till we can implement plans. And we've done it on our own. What is not happening is a realistic effort on the part of the three levels of government. And I'll just sidetrack for a second on new buildings. Everybody in the modern world knows that there's more condo construction in Toronto than the rest of North America put together. The regulations on energy efficient are abysmal. The structures are just, it's virtually a free-for-all where maybe 1% treats it seriously. But I'll go back to the older buildings. We've replaced toilet systems for water conservation twice in 20 years. Why? Because the city did kick in a few dollars at one time, the second time it did, but it pays to do it. The payback is relatively short, particularly when hydro and water rates keep going up. We've done electrical refits. Why? Because again, it pays to do it. Where was the province in terms of legislating sub-metering? You know, these buildings were built with 1 meter, 1 electrical meter for the whole building. Go into any apartments in the middle of the day, you'll see TV sets on, all the lights on, nobody home. So now on our own, because of good financing plan through sub-metering companies, it doesn't cost us a penny, and we're putting in an individual meter for each apartment, but it'll take 10 years to get everybody on because of the Landlord-Tenant Act. So here's where the city, particularly the province in this case, is really weak and short-sighted. The tower renewal, I've got the document on my desk. It's going to be complicated. I don't think that many owners, developers are going to go for it. I think we have to sit down, negotiate, all parties. Instead of having a battle with 25 parties, I think we did a dance with 25 parties and come up with something at the end. So what would be involved in getting this thing moving, and not just for 10% of the buildings, but for 100%?
And then we'll take the next question, and we'll wrap up then. Thank you.
Hi, Lloyd Helferty, representing the biochar initiatives, both locally, provincially, and nationally. I have a fairly different question, and it does relate to urbanization, but it also relates, I'm in a sector where I had to deal with and talk to people from both the urban sector and also from the rural sector. And I guess the question is around the large divide that exists between the urban and rural in this country, especially. There is a significant divide between the understanding of people that live in cities and and the people that manage the land, the farmers, the foresters, et cetera. So I guess I'd like to get your take on how we bridge that. Because again, I'm coming from a sector that's talking to both these people, and they have both very different perspectives on sort of the path forward.
Maybe I'll answer the last question, if my esteemed panelists will allow me. My research is in small and rural communities. And it gets back to Sarah's comment about if we take an ecosystem approach, because we know cities are dependent ecologically on small and rural communities, on the adjacent communities. So we have to look at how do we increase the connectivity between the small, the mid, and the large urban centers, and what does that mean? And what role does Web 3.0 technologies have to play in that? What role does moving some of the workforce out virtually to smaller communities to diversify their economies? There's all sorts of issues there. That's another grand dialogue that I hope we start having as a country, and as well the aging population as well. Because the ground is shifting under our feet as we sit here. The whole world is shifting.
So to answer that, or partly that first question, and I'll use that latter part of the discussion, that 10%, how do we get it moving and what is it really required? We don't do a good job of aligning our programs across Canada, any province, about the various incentive programs that are out there, whether they're utility-based, municipal-based, provincial-based, or federal government-based. And one of our starting points is to actually make sure that they are aligned so that when you come to that point of where you're interested in retrofitting your building, you understand what's available for you and how to apply through a one-window door opportunity, not 6 times or 5 different or 4 different ways to do it. That's just good customer relationship and good business. That's partly where we need to go on one. Second, just to pull on Toronto Atmospheric Fund, they've done some great work, and I think the energy efficiency mortgage that they had out there, I probably got the wrong title for it, but what it did is I think it shifted the thinking in the community about where you would get money to do retrofits that take a longer payback period potentially, and or place a higher burden on probably renters or those with low income, and how best to address that. And I think those kinds of tools need to be brought forward more actively for deployment. But we've changed our legislation to allow them here. Whether that's currently we've got different tools now in Ontario that can be used for that. Tax increment financing is one, but there's others that are now available. How we roll them out, we actually have to start to roll them out. And I think we'll see that shortly, and it will help people like yourself who are developers or who are owners and operators looking to improve their building. But don't forget that you don't have to do it on your own. There is people like the Better Building Partnership Program, and I don't know if you've reached out to people like that who can help walk through that process. One more example that I didn't know about, but I've learned about, was Enbridge Gas, who has the full program for energy retrofit buildings to actually help you do all the designs, figure out, and then understand whether that can be aligned with the utility bill. And so that it's a better harmonization of linking direct usage to retrofits, so it can go to the renter or it goes to the owner of the building. So there's multiple programs out there. The problem is there's multiple programs. And so how we get that better aligned is my way of answering your question. We've got to do that first. We're trying to do that. Others are trying to do that. And that should actually help accelerate implementation going forward.
So we've heard a lot about alignment, about the need to change the rules of the game, even maybe start addressing the federal, provincial, constitutional, 18th century structure that we have in place. I started off by introducing the panel talking about Toronto not being walkable according to the cab drivers. Well, you know what? I had a great day yesterday because it took me an hour to walk, and Toronto is walkable. So this brings me to something called cultural embeddedness. How do we culturally embed sustainability in Canada's cities across the country? So I'll end on this note. I had the privilege of doing some research in Amsterdam a couple months ago, and all my younger environmental friends told me Amsterdam is the most environmentally friendly country in the world. And it gets back a bit to Jamie's earlier comment. So I was amazed. I was advised you have to actually watch for the bicycle paths as well as for car traffic. And it was incredible. So then we met with this team of a small research institute, and we said, my God, Amsterdam's so incredibly environmental and blah, blah, blah. And they said, what are you talking about? They had no climate change adaptation and mitigation grand strategies in place in the research community that we were talking with. But they said, go back to our history, Anne. We're merchants. It's cheap. We're mercantile. That's cultural embeddedness. So how do we, everything we've talked about today, first of all, keep it high on the political agenda and culturally embed it so it just becomes the norm. And people have choices, and we don't have to make decisions all the time about what's right and what's wrong. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Brent. I cannot, my head is spinning. I think I have to go and have lunch. I have to remind you that lunch is on the second floor in the University Ballroom. Thank you for an incredible discussion.